Are you familiar with this term, cancel culture? If you watch the news or even on social media, this term is coming up, especially more in recent years, of canceling someone. And what this basically is kind of this almost mob mentality, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. It happens on any and all of the spectrum, socially, politically, and all that. But it's modern day ostracism. That's what it is. It's a modern day shunning of a person, whether it be in person, online, or social media, which is online. But when a group of people collectively decide somehow, when the internet decides, we're going to cancel this person for their views or their speech or their actions or whatever, and that person is then deemed canceled. And there's almost a sense of pride in collectively doing this. Now, I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying this is what's going on in our society today. And the reason that I think this is not really a good thing is that it's really a form of virtual signaling. It's how can I appear virtuous? How can I look like I really care about this or that topic or issue with minimum cost to myself? Virtue signaling. I mean, in our society, if we had, in our culture today, if we had virtuous people, that'd be much better. But instead, for the most part, we have a bunch of virtue signaling, which doesn't really change anything, and it's really about making the person themselves feel better. Oh yeah, this is a terrible thing that happened. I'm gonna tweet about it. Doesn't really do much. I'm gonna post about it. Doesn't really do too much. Instead of actively getting involved in a cause that you are for or against, right? It's virtue signaling. And here's the thing about cancel culture. If the accuser denies it, if the accused denies it, then the accuser feels validated. See, they're lying. If the accused confesses it and apologizes, the accusers see, I told you. And then they go on continuing to cancel them. Once you've been deemed canceled, there's no way out. You just have to ride the storm. It's not really to correct a wrong. The point is, I think, in my opinion, virtue signaling. And today's passage in John chapter 8 is cancel culture. 2,000 years ago, in the ancient context of Jesus' day, it's cancel culture going on there too. Let's read the passage. In chapter 8, verse 1, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses, commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?' They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing them, but Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, 'Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her.' Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?' 'No one, sir,' she said. 'Then neither do I condemn you,' Jesus declared. 'Now go and leave your life of sin.'" Let's talk about the con artists themselves here. And that comes from verses 3 to 4. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery." Now, we have to understand that the teachers and the Pharisees were recognized in their society as expositors of the law. This comes without, of course, right? That's what their role is. But what is not so obvious to us today is they were also considered lawyers and judges and even juries, depending on the circumstance. So it's not just they were religious or theologians, just not teachers of theology or Jewish history or culture. They were also part of the Jewish legal system. The law of Moses isn't just a spiritual or religious book. It's also civic, parts of it. It's a legal document in addition to being a spiritual book. And the official charge here, legally, is adultery. That's what they're doing in this situation. And in Deuteronomy 22:23, which is the law of Moses, here's what it says. If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. In other words, the Old Testament punishment for an engaged woman who is unfaithful to her fiancé is death by stoning, but not just her, by both parties involved. That's the punishment. In the law of Deuteronomy, in the Old Testament, that's the punishment. And I understand by our modern ears, this sounds like too much. This sounds too extreme. But I want you to understand a consistent theme of God throughout the scriptures is that when it comes to preserving the integrity of the family for God's chosen people or for God's children, not even just chosen people, but in the New Testament, God's children. When it comes to preserving the integrity of the family, God takes it very seriously. And especially in the Old Testament, when he's beginning to form this community, when they're more fragile, where if something could happen in this society, in this group of small-knit, close community of group of God's people, it would destroy the early beginnings. So because of that, he's especially protective of the social relationship between his children. Now, here's the obvious question, according to that law, where's the man? Takes two to tango. Where is the man in this situation? And how do you only catch one in the act of adultery? That's what the passage says. How is it possible to only catch the woman in this? And even if the man escaped, let's say he just took off and ran, this is a small town. This is a small village. Everyone knows this person. There's nowhere he could really run to. They know who he is in this ancient little village. So here's my speculation, and this is speculation, it's not in the passage, but my speculation is that the accusers, the leaders here, the religious teachers, Pharisees, all that, they actually knew about the affair going on. And what they did was entrapment. They probably, let's give the benefit of the doubt and say the man actually had feelings for the woman and all that, right? Benefit of the doubt. But what they did was they entrapped the man. And they also then, of course, entrapped the woman here involved too. That's my speculation. We know that Jesus' accusers are not beyond bribery. We know they're not beyond like bending the rules or breaking the rules to accomplish their ultimate goal. The ends justify the means. So I think that's what's really going on here. And the con we see in verses 5 and 6a. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him, Jesus. They asked the question based on the law of Moses, but they don't really care about justice. It's not their point. They don't care about preserving the society or the family structure. They don't care about any of that. Jesus isn't a lawyer. He's a teacher, but he's not a lawyer. He's not involved in the Jewish legal system. But they're asking him as a trap a legal question. This is the trap. If Jesus would have disavowed the law of Moses, then he loses credibility with all of his Jewish followers and all the people who are just in the town, the Jewish town. Jesus would also be charged in the Jewish courts with lawlessness, which is actually a very serious offense in the Jewish court system. If Jesus upholds the law of Moses as presented, then he's supporting a position that was largely very unpopular in that society. And that might be confusing, but here's what's going on. Deuteronomy was written a long time ago. The law is the law. It's in the books. We're talking about the civic law here. It's in the books. But what happens as time goes on is society changes. The norms of society change faster than the laws are updated. That happens today, too. Do you know in Maryland, it's in the books. It's illegal to do fortune telling. It's against the Maryland state law to do fortune telling. And you can Google this stuff, and all throughout the 50 states, there's these ridiculous, archaic laws that just haven't been updated, and it doesn't matter because no one really enforces it. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying that, adultery is okay. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying here is the punishment for adultery that was written in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, was not really enforced in Jesus' day. That's what I'm saying. And you better believe me that his accusers, they were ready. They had rocks in their hand, they had stones. As soon as Jesus gave any indication of we must uphold the law, they're chucking rocks. Why? Because then the death penalty was only executed by the Romans, the crucifixion. The Jews did not have the right to execute someone under Roman rule. So what they would say is, Jesus, he's the ringleader. Jesus said it was good to do it. He's to blame. They would execute this woman and then tell Rome, Jesus is the dude. Jesus goes to prison. He'd probably be executed right there. Here is the challenge that's brought up in verse 6. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. What did he write? We don't know. There are people who speculate, like scholars and commentators, modern day, who speculate maybe he's writing their names. Writing their names. Because no one is without sin except for Jesus. Jesus says, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her," which is one of the most misused Bible passages today. I've heard it. I'm talking to people who are honestly justifying their behavior, justifying their own sin. Let he without sin cast the first stone. And it's used as a way to justify, like, don't talk to me, don't challenge me about my sin. You have sin too. That's not what Jesus is saying here. He's actually giving a legal defense to this legal question. Although he's not a lawyer, he knows his stuff. He is not saying a person must be sinless to identify sin and call it out. That's what he's not saying. What he is saying is, according to the Jewish law, the Mosaic law, in a legal sense, that, talking about Deuteronomy, that the first person to throw the stone must not also be guilty of that specific sin. That's what he's talking about. I'm not making this up. It's there. Like, if you read the commentary and the rabbinic writings surrounding the Jewish law, it's not saying you can't call out any sin. It's saying, though, in this process of execution through stoning, the first person to throw that stone must not be guilty of the same sin that's being accused. That's what Jesus is saying. The Mosaic law understood that there is a conflict of interest. The first person to throw the stone, they may be deflecting their own personal struggle with sin and pointing at someone else to bring shame and attention on someone else to cover for their own issue of sin. You know what that is? It's cancel culture. That's what that is. Ancient cancel culture. Today, many people use Jesus' words and they say, "Don't judge me." But that's a complete misuse of the passage, which completely ignores the context. And also, judge in the scriptures most often means evaluation. It's not negative or positive. What makes it negative or positive is what you did. But judge just means to evaluate in most cases. What Jesus is doing is pointing out the hypocrisy of the accusers, not as a free pass to sin and not get called out on it, because that's what people use it for today. That's completely not what Jesus is saying. So then here is the conviction. Verse 9, at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman standing there. Now look, surely not everyone in that crowd, in this mob, was guilty of adultery. That's probably not what's happening here. What is most likely happening is that they remember Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, where they understand that it's not the specific act of adultery, but that lust in the heart and adultery are related, which is what Jesus was teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. They remembered that these are related sins. And so they started to leave one by one. And those that came to trap Jesus realized their trap failed. There's no angry mob. There's not going to be any execution here. So even those who came to trap Jesus left. Now, it's not because they were convicted, most likely, but it's because they realized Jesus defeated them. Jesus defeated lawyers using the law. And the circle of people who were surrounding this woman in her most shameful moment, that group, they all left one by one until it was only her and Jesus. And Jesus cleanses her then. In verse 10, Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you." Jesus declared, "Go now and leave your life of sin." This is the first time that Jesus speaks directly with the woman, right? The whole other story, the rest of it, he's speaking with the religious leaders who came to trap him. Now, if you were Jesus, put yourself in his shoes, and you're there alone with the woman, and you just had escaped this super tense situation, high drama, high emotion, potential angry mobs, all the things at risk, this woman's life literally at risk here. If you had just escaped this super tense situation and no one else was around except for you and her, what would you ask? No one else is around. I would ask, where's the dude? How did this happen? I would ask, was this a setup? Because if you have proof that this is a setup, now we can go after the religious leaders, right? Those who bribe people or entrap people. If this is a setup and you have proof, now we can get justice through that. Or, on a moral level, judgy level, how could you do such a thing? You're engaged to someone else, according to the Deuteronomy story. How could you do such? But Jesus doesn't do any of that. Instead, he asks this question: where are your accusers? That's what he asks. He doesn't ask, where's the dude? Was this a setup? How could you do this? No, he asks, where are your accusers? And this woman who was dragged in front of Jesus through a crowd, put in the middle, everyone forms a circle around them, caught in her most shameful moment of sin. Jesus forgives her. This woman who's full of shame leaves with grace. Here's what it means for us today. When we come to Jesus, like honestly, when we come to him admitting, hey, we have sin, I've messed up. When we come to him, 100% of the time, we receive grace. We don't have to hide things or just tell like the half-truths or justify everything by the context or the circumstance or they made me do it. We just come to Jesus and just admit. This woman was guilty of it. So was the dude. They were both guilty of this. Yet Jesus didn't condemn her. He protected her. He diffused the situation. And then he forgave her and said, go and sin no more. Those who come to Jesus will be forgiven every single time. Don't need to blame circumstances for our personal choices to sin. We don't need to blame other people for our personal choices to sin. We don't need to blame our past and scarring for our current personal decisions to sin. We don't need to do any of that. There's no point. Because when we come before Jesus and just confess, we receive forgiveness every single time. Now, when Jesus says, go and sin no more, he's not saying try harder. He's not telling the woman, hey, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and really give your maximum effort. That's not what he's saying. He knows that we will mess up. He knows every possible way we're going to mess up. And yet, he made it possible for all of us to be fully cleansed of all of our sin. And he doesn't just leave us with a pep talk. He leaves us the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, which will empower us to live a life of holiness as worship unto God. So let me just close today's message with one verse, John 3:17. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. This is one of the most encouraging stories of the Gospels that we read, right? And it's no different for us. No matter what the sin, God will forgive us, fill us with the Spirit, if we're Christians, and then empower us to move and grow and learn and move on from there.